People have been using cannabis for many different applications over time, but there are no standards which are accepted by everybody as the ones to use. Last year, the American Chemical Society had a workshop on cannabis, and they were saying how you can go to 3 different labs and get 3 different results. And that's an issue.
20 years ago, the cannabis industry was led by people who took a tremendous amount of risk to bring a new class of medication to people who are really suffering. And as the industry has grown over the last 2 decades, we've seen more sophisticated businesses come in, and they're coming in with larger financial capability.
This industry was just growing explosively, and there's all these people using cannabis for medical purposes with compromised immune systems, and that really something needed to happen to control the quality and safety of cannabis.
Clearly, standards for education, training, and business operations are an urgent national priority in the US and Europe and the rest of the world.
ASTM is an international organization that is widely recognized as a leading constituency in the formulation of standardized test methods in many different industries.
Whether you're a major corporation or just from a small laboratory, you've got the same voice. So every perspective gets handled and listened to.
And what's unique about ASTM is it brings together voices of the industry.
People from the pharmaceutical industries.
People from a wide variety of backgrounds, including representative of government agencies, as well as industry stakeholders such as producers, cultivators, manufacturers, and individuals who participate in dispensing cannabis products.
Cannabis isn't going away. I think the driving force will be education, and ASTM actually offers that platform.
Above all, training and education is really important in developing these standards.
People have a right to know what they're receiving, and they have a right to know that what they're getting is safe.
You need to have a proper way of knowing what's out there and how to measure it.
The ASTM process is a critical component of this.
ASTM just brings it all together.
By bringing standards to an international level of acceptance across jurisdictional boundaries may truly ensure that medical cannabis patients have access to cannabis for therapeutic uses, and researchers have access to it to study it.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the Notions and Reflections in Cannabis video podcast. And I appreciate everyone for tuning in. If you like the content and you like what you see, please click like and subscribe. Ring that bell, I guess is what you're supposed to say. It's up there somewhere, I'm not sure. I have the great honor of having 2 amazing gentlemen that have played a huge role in making the cannabis industry a better place, not only in the United States, but in the world. And I'd like to introduce them. We have Dr. Ralph Paroli. And Dr. Paroli was the chairman of ASTM D37, and he was the first chairman of the D37 committee, which is specifically all about cannabis and creating standards in cannabis. And we might get Ralph to share some stories about the beginning of that committee and potential interesting events that occurred, and possibly some of the controversies around that. And then D37 had the fabulous fortune to have Bob Morgan step in as the technical director of it. And Bob is an ASTM staffer who's typically responsible for multiple technical committees. And Bob took the reins of D37, and we formed what now is a very successful ASTM Standards Committee on Cannabis, starting from a handful of members to I think we're sitting at over 1,100 now in something like 30 countries. We've been pretty prolific in the standards we're putting out there. We have more work to do. It seems to never end, but these gentlemen really have started almost a revolution in helping to standardize the cannabis industry. And it's with great honor that we're here to have a conversation. And maybe as an intro, you guys could reflect, learning about the formation of D37 and how you came to be part of the genesis of that technical committee. We can start with Bob on that.
Well, thank you, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I was fortunate in that I was in my 35th year at working at ASTM International and had the opportunity to work with a variety of industries along the way. And the opportunity came up to for ASTM to explore the cannabis space to see if it was an area that ASTM could help fulfill standards to make cannabis safe for consumers and everything that goes along with that. And I was able to work with Ralph. They asked me if I would be willing to take this on, and I was fortunate enough to be able to work with Ralph, who at the time was on the ASTM Board of Directors back in 2017. And the board approved the formation of D37. Ralph became the first chairman, and we had a great group of members from industry, all walks of industry, willing to participate and help shape the content of standards that will potentially have an impact on the way this industry moves forward. So I've been, really fortunate to be able to have that opportunity to work in an emerging area like this.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. Dr. Ralph, what are your thoughts, sir?
Well, I'll echo what Bob said. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be able to work with Bob and ASTM in general on this. The way I got involved was actually in 2016. I was chairman of the board for ASTM. And as a result, I was invited to give a talk by a group called NCSL, which is for metrology background and on calibrations and laboratories do calibrations. And I was going to talk about how the two organizations could work together. And then it turned out that the second keynote was going to be somebody who's going to be speaking on cannabis. And so I was asked if I would be okay with that. And I checked back with various organizations, and yes, everything was good. And then I said, okay, well, in that case, why don't I just talk about how we could develop cannabis standards, thinking that there were many already in place. And the more I read, the more I saw that there were issues about industry complaining that they can go to 3 different labs and get 3 different results, users not being happy either with what they're getting. And if that wasn't a great opening for standards, I don't know what is. And so I actually had approached ASTM at that point about that. And that's when I was informed that others had also just mentioned to ASTM about the idea of doing this on cannabis. And we started working together. The reason of course, from my side, that was also of interest was because being with the Government of Canada, National Research Council, Canada had legalized cannabis and it was about to come into effect. So obviously, the need to have standards and the likes was critical from that perspective, for again making sure that not only from a government side that they know, from a taxation side, et cetera, but from the users to make sure that the users have something which is safe, whether it's for medical or adult use is irrelevant. That they need to have a safe supply and know that you're getting what you're supposed to be getting.
Absolutely. And both your contributions have really put this technical committee, D37, on the map. And I think it's a very prideful thing. I'm going to just say, I can't help myself. I have to tell a little story about how I got involved with it, which is rather amusing. Ralph and I go back over 20 years or something like that, maybe 19 years, something like that, where we worked together in DO8, which is roofing and waterproofing. And at the time, I worked for Duralast Roofing as a quality control R&D manager. And time went by and I left Duralast and kind of went down a different path. So I was no longer really completely involved with ASTM, though whenever Ralph and I were in the same city, of course, we'd get together and carry on because we had developed a very strong friendship at that point. And I moved to New Orleans, and began working and managing the quality control laboratory for the Domino Sugar Refinery, which I did for 5 years. And the ASTM meeting happened to be in New Orleans, and Ralph came, and of course, per usual, we got on the phone and we went to a nice little New Orleans jazz outdoor bar and drank red wine and listened to good jazz music. And Ralph asked me, well, guess what committee I'm now chairman of? And of course, I had no idea. And when he said cannabis, I just like, kind of, really? Wow. We never talked about cannabis. So I just started like, wow, okay. But I knew Ralph's capabilities, so I knew that whatever excellence would prevail in that position. Now, you got to remember the cannabis industry, well, at least D37 is a relatively new committee. And a lot of the people in the industry in cannabis are younger folks that haven't necessarily gone down the path of ASTM, and of course, I'd been with Ralph at ASTM probably for a good 11 years. So I was kind of at that point a gray beard, I guess you'd call us. And Ralph asked me, well, why don't you come down to the meeting? And, there might be some subcommittee chairs that will get advice from you or whatever, help teach these new people about the ASTM thing or whatever. And I thought, I got some vacation time. Why not? I went down there and I talked to a few people. I talked to Andrew Saman of the Quality Management Subcommittee, because quality has been my basically career in one way or another. And a little bit later, I ended up becoming the vice chairman of D3702, which is the QMS subcommittee. And working with Andrew and working with Dave Valancourt, I ended up resigning from Duralast and going and becoming a full-time cannabis consultant. And all of that happened because of that wonderful conversation that Ralph and my bride Gretchen and I had at Bacchanal's on Poland Street in New Orleans. I forget the name of the band, but it was pretty good. And anyway, I wanted to add that story because it's amazing the paths that life can put right in front of you and have the courage to embrace them and run after them and just let the universe make it happen for you. Anyway, that's my sermon for today. But let's get back to the discussion relative to and Ralph, I'm going to pose this question to you. It is a new industry, and it's an industry fraught with a lot of problems, and those problems extend from lack of regulatory continuity on possibly even a global level. And what do we do, and what should the states do, and what would you think were the biggest weaknesses of the industry? And as practitioners and workers trying to improve the industry, what should we be doing? And I just kind of want to get that sort of global vision from you based on those weaknesses.
Sure. So, I'll just start off though by saying something that you had mentioned. And one of the great things of D37 is the fact that we have a lot of young people, of course, who are involved and willing to learn about standards, but also that reflects a good cross section of society. We have people because of the ASTM model, of course. So we make sure to have people who are users, general interest, for people from the industry, people who are regulators, all the people are at the table. And all that helps lend to the credibility of the standards that we develop. And I think that's a major part as to what's needed to overcome some of the issues. You realize, I think we all realize, it's a once in a lifetime really opportunity to have this, where something that was illegal before is now legal. It's a bit like what happened with alcohol, if you think about it. So some of the issues that we're running into are not necessarily unexpected. And the key, though, is to be able to build confidence in the consumers. If the consumers are confident that they're getting what they're supposed to, it goes up the chain. So that means that they know that the industry is supplying what's needed, and then the government knows that what the industry is saying it is doing, and it can verify that. And so now the government believes in what's being done. And of course, in North America, we're lucky that, Canada obviously is a bit further ahead of the game than in the US, but the US, I think, is going to be coming along as well. But we are more open to this, and so we're able to allow industry and the user, everybody else, to come to the table and say, here's what's needed and why we need this. And then we get the regulations, and then people start believing in it. And as a result, a lot of the issues that we're seeing will be minimized. They'll never disappear, of course. That's always an issue that comes there. But the minimization of the risks, I mean, you can imagine for people who are taking cannabis for medical reasons, their immunity system is compromised already, and so making sure that they have things which are pure and have no pesticides and the right quantity of THC, for example, that's all necessary for people to believe in the system and what they're getting, and that there is actually confidence there.
Agreed. Thank you for that. And Bob, do you have any thoughts along those same lines?
Well, just the idea, it's just challenging for any new emerging industry to assemble and become an ASTM technical committee and get work done. And this industry, like many other industries that ASTM has been involved with, has risen to the occasion, and they recognize that they have an opportunity to shape the content of the standard to meet their needs. And when they have that realization, that kind of snowballs into a whole technical committee that has the variety, as Ralph said, which is a requirement in ASTM. There needs to be a balance of interests between the producers, the users, the researchers. So because of that balance, and people have the opportunity to voice their opinions, and an individual's opinion counts as much as a large corporation's opinion, they're equal in the ASTM process. They realize that it's a great opportunity to help make things better for the industry. And, the end result is, because we have a diverse group of people from all parts of the industry, is a standard that has marketplace relevance. And that marketplace relevance makes the difference with regard to whether that standard is going to be adopted or used. And it's been a proven track record at ASTM. You get the right people at the table, and the output will serve the best interest of the industry. And I see it happening in Committee D37 on cannabis.
Excellent, thank you. And that just brings me a thought, and I know Ralph and I briefly talked about this last week, but you look at the legal status of cannabis and the evolution of that status, and kind of can see a similar parallel emerging with psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, fungus, and those kind of things. And I'm seeing more and more medical research looking at those as various therapies. And that, do you see it? Do you think we might be looking at a future where we have an ASTM committee on psychedelics?
So I guess I'll say I hope so. You look at, in general, in the Canadian daily newspapers, you're seeing psychedelics being mentioned more often. And you're seeing the research, although you don't see the research papers necessarily, you do see the mentioning, those research papers in the papers. So I think overall, people are starting to be more open to that idea. And again, we'll need to have similar standards that we have done for cannabis. And so that, I think that would open. Now, obviously, ASTM, the committee gets formed based on what ASTM, if ASTM approves it, just like we have to do for cannabis. And so the whole case has to be done for it, but that's
right. Sure.
I'm hoping to see standards being developed in the future.
And relative to that, if there's any viewers out there that that piqued their interest a little bit and might have some contributions they could make at looking at that, or an interest in that, please feel free to communicate with me at my email. And that'll be at the end of this video. But it's definitely worth a discussion. Now cycling back to cannabis, one of the issues that I've noted, and I'm just going to throw this out there and basically seek your advice as to maybe a best path to deal with it. I have an idea myself, but I've done a fair amount of cannabis consulting, and a lot of the efforts have been to make a given facility, compliant with typical GMP regulations, right? Because you make gummies, you make food stuffs. There's a certain expectation that you follow food safety protocol that's specified and in the United States by the CFR program from the FDA, particularly 117, or dietary supplements 111. And these have very strict sort of protocol for assuring sanitation and risk reduction in that. In Canada, typically we look at the UDRALEX 4.0 documents or ICH documents that define things on kind of a similar basis to what the FDA does, and maybe even more global in its application than the FDA guidelines. But at the end of the day, going into a mom and pop shop and watching them do their CBD extractions, and they got a dirt floor and they've got screened in windows and raw product out on the benches, and that at the end of the day, getting these entities compliant with those type of super risk mitigating guidelines, most of these people can't afford it. Now, the big players, of which there's a handful, can afford to go the full blown, sanitation, GMP clean rooms or whatever is prescribed based on their product and its application. And that is a big challenge. And right now, working with the state of Colorado, there's a lot of questions about, we want the product to be safe, and we can make all kinds of standards to say what you have to do, but how do you do it in such a way that it doesn't break the bank? You end up losing 80% of the participants because they cannot afford what it takes to get to those levels of sanitation. And my response was, well, maybe we don't need to start with getting them certified, but let's start with developing some dummy down sanitation practices, a checklist, something that it doesn't go the full complex, rigorous end of the guidelines, but it does start awakening the producers to the value of doing risk assessments and making sure their products are safe. And there's like some minimal things you can do that can completely turn around a facility where they wouldn't have a product that could possibly compromise the health of a consumer in any way. And then, of course, that comes in with the analytical testing, which again is problematic because different labs still get different results. A lot of the test methods have not been standardized still. I know ASTM's working on standards, but they're in a large part not used in other facilities who've kind of developed their own standards. And so there's still a lot of room for activity, but how do you mitigate the expense of perfection relative to the sort of baseline producers that may not be able to afford it? And that's a big problem. And I'd really like to hear what you guys might have to say about that or think about that.
Well, the only thing I would say, and Ralph probably has a better perspective, but from an ASTM perspective, if those 80% or so people that have trouble financially, if they're at the table at the committee, the document, they have an opportunity to make change in the documents to accommodate their particular concerns or needs. And if they're able to get consensus, that's the way it works in ASTM. But there's no question that that's a challenge for this industry because just the normal scrutiny that goes with operations, with products, consumable products are very stringent. And it's a high bar, but I have a feeling that the evolution of Committee D37, that high bar will be reached through a strong standards architecture to ensure quality, with taking into consideration some of the real factors that these small players face.
That's a great answer, and you're exactly right. And I know it's very important to a lot of the states who are gaining and doing very well economically to make sure that this producer base is supported and isn't going to go away. So there's always that push and balance of, well, how far do we want to go? And it's a challenge. It's being talked about in Colorado, I know quite a bit. And how do we do it? How do we do it? Do we keep entities alive and functional so that they can contribute to the success of the industry, yet making sure the consumers are safe? Interesting dilemma. What are your thoughts, Ralph, on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think, the first and foremost, it's the last point you mentioned. That is, we want a safe supply of cannabis for the general population. And so that has to come above everything else. Now, for the smaller enterprises, which are trying to get into this area, yes, as Bob mentioned, as long as they're at the table, they can say, look, this works too, and you don't have to go to that extreme of what we're pushing for. And that's no different from other industries. We see this everywhere, where smaller groups trying to break in are confronted with the cost. But it's always come back to, first and foremost, can you provide a safe product to the users?
Mm-hmm.
And you work from there. And then if you want to really help the small, medium enterprises, the SMEs, or the mom and pops, if you like, in other cases, that I believe is where government can have a role to play too. What kind of either tax breaks or subsidies can be given to those groups to make sure that they can be there and help and grow the industry as a whole, and then grow jobs that go with it. And I think that's where government and industry can work together once they know what the standards are, and be keeping in mind all the time that you want a safe supply or a safe product for individuals.
That's a great answer. And you I know down here in Louisiana, we're seeing a lot of that kind of business strategy with solar panels, where the tax breaks and government subsidies are really allowing deployment of that within the framework of a reasonable return on investment, which 10 years ago just really didn't work relative to the cost. And so, yeah, I hadn't thought of that angle, but I think you're absolutely spot on with that.
And I'll just add also to that, Carrie, and that's again one of the great things about being involved with ASTM. And Bob can correct me if I'm wrong or give more specific numbers, but the standards that are developed at ASTM are used like 95% of the world population, something in that area. So by helping industries around the world, whichever government's involved, they know they get access to the world through using those standards. So it's in everybody's best interest to have good, reliable standards, and then having the industry from your home country get involved and be able to participate at the table.
Agreed. Well, that half hour flew by like nobody's business. So I do try to keep these to a half hour so they're not too burdensome on the bandwidth of YouTube or LinkedIn or what have you. But I think you both provided some great insight. And again, I need to express my appreciation of your participation in this effort. I know it seems like we could sit here and talk about this all day long, right? But anyway, no, I thank you very much. Again, we've had Dr. Ralph Paroli, and former chair of the first ASTM Technical Committee on Cannabis, D37, and the esteemed Robert Morgan, who's the first technical director for D37 on cannabis. And these guys really put it together and started out from the gate, led it, and now it is actually a quite successful technical committee writing standards. We have tons of members, Much thanks to their leadership. So with that, I think I'll conclude the interview. Again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Ralph. And I'm just going to disengage the recording, but I won't hang up yet, so stand by. Unless you have any famous last words you'd like to throw out.
Well, I actually, I don't know if it's famous, but I will say, and thank you, Carrie, for being involved and doing things like this. It's members like you who end up helping develop these standards into something which is useful for everybody. I mean, we have 1,000 members, over 1,000 members, of course, and some of them are more active than others, but it's really because of the hard work that everybody does and is the willingness to share the information and put the effort into developing these standards that it takes place. So it's thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you, Ralph. Wouldn't be doing it without your influence, sir. Okay, here we go. Boom. Oops.